We're going to move on to China. And this is in the theme of persecution, as we saw with Sri Lanka. And I wanted to look into this situation for some time because it's been probably 6 months or even a bit more that we've seen persecution against the church rising in China, and scattered stories have been coming out here and there of different things that have been done, and I wanted to look into it. And it's true, there are worrying signs of a widespread crackdown on Christians in the country of China. The Chinese church has enjoyed spectacular growth under conditions of increasing freedom for some time now. It's been getting freer and freer, and the government's been pursuing policies of increased freedom in many ways, not just in commerce and trade, but also around religion and things like that. And the Christian community now makes up about 2.5% of the Chinese population, which is about 40 million people. And that's been growing at a rate of about 6.5% year on year for some decades now. But that suddenly seems to be changing. There's a raft of new policies coming in at the behest of the central government, and they're having consequences. A raft of those were introduced in February of 2018 under the guise of protecting against religious extremism and foreign infiltration. And for those who keep up with communistic doublespeak, protecting against religious extremism could mean a range of things, let's just put it that way. Groups are explicitly banned from teaching about religion unless they are registered with the government, and oversight of those groups that are registered has increased enormously. The US State Department has, on December the 10th, included China amongst 10 countries designated as countries of particular concern for severe religious rights violation. Now, if you're among just 10 countries in that category, you probably have some peers in that group that are not great places for Christians to be. Why? Why has that happened? Well, let's take a look. Let's run through some things. There's obviously the big brother concerns about the registration of churches with the state, but also the following. The senior Chinese official who oversees state-sanctioned churches has pledged to rid the faith of any Western imprint, and has called on the Sinicization of religion, that is the Chinesefication of religion. And you say, well, how would that happen? Well, for one thing, a new Communist Party authorized version of the Bible to be translated with annotations included, interpretive annotations, and the forced integration of traditional Chinese culture into liturgy, music, clerical clothing, and church buildings. The communist government regards religion as subversive to state power. And this is something that the Christian church has grappled with throughout centuries, where governments who want total control see religion as an organising force outside of the government, and therefore it must be clamped down on. And that's been one of the unique things about the Western story, where the government's actually gone, yeah, that's true actually. We should take a sideways step to let people have freedom of religion because there's authority outside of us. But in a communistic system of thinking, that's never going to happen. They regard religion as that threat to their ideological control. So Christians are often being charged with inciting subversion of state power. Now that's a jailable offence of some length. I mean, I'm going to get to a story in a minute where people have been jailed for 15 years for inciting subversion of state power. And you think, well, what does inciting subversion mean? I don't know. If you say Jesus Christ is king, is that inciting subversion? If you read Isaiah 6, he's on his throne, he's reigning above all the kings, is that inciting subversion of state power? Probably yes. There's all sorts of things in Christian teaching that could be misunderstood in that way. Even the idea of the apostles in Acts saying we must obey God rather than men. Render to Caesar what's Caesar's and God's what's God's. Well, you're in a lot of trouble when the government's cracking down on that sort of thing. The chairman of the government body that runs state-controlled Protestant churches has said this: some believers lack national consciousness, so we have this saying, one more Christian, one less Chinese. So you can see there's that subversive paranoia going on. In the lead up to Christmas, a 40-year-old church in Guangzhou with a congregation in the thousands was shut down. The same was seen of Beijing Zion Church, which is also one of the largest churches in the capital. And since then, reports of governments, that was in the lead up to Christmas when all this was, getting worse. And from that point forward, there's a plethora of stories which I could highlight. I'm only going to have to touch on a couple to give a sense of what's going on. But essentially, reports of the government offering cash incentives to citizens who report on the illegal religious activities of their neighbours have come through. And house church leaders have speculated that came in just before Easter because the opportunity was about to be very rich. The sense that there'll be lots of people actually attending house churches and doing Easter celebrations, and neighbours can report on those religious activities to the government and actually get up to $1,500 for doing so. The government has required registered churches to install facial recognition cameras to monitor their congregants, which is pretty serious, so they can keep a tab on whoever's there. Gary Bauer of the US Commission on International Religious Freedom told of one Beijing pastor who refused that edict and would not put the cameras in place. He says they took him and most of the church leadership away in the middle of the night, and they have not been heard from since. That was around the same time that Catholic Bishop Cardinal Joseph Zen was also taken into custody, and he too has whereabouts unknown. This is the gravity of what's going on. People are being carried away in the night and not heard from. Churches and other religious buildings have been destroyed by the government. There was a convent in the north that was taken down, but also various stories have emerged of crosses being removed, religious paraphernalia being taken away, and church buildings seriously damaged by the government. Police raids have seen dozens of underground Christians taken into custody. For example, there were coordinated police raids which saw around 100 members of Early Rain Covenant Church taken from their homes and streets. The phone lines for that church were blocked, and so too were the social media accounts of the congregants, of the members, before the police raids took place. And the remaining church members, who are most of them in hiding, found their pastor's house, him and his wife's home, ransacked and completely empty. And he has been taken away to an unknown location, and he could be charged with inciting subversion of state power, up to 15 years in prison. Other leaders remain under 24-hour government surveillance in their homes. That's one example, Early Rain Covenant Church. But here's the thing. The pastor of that church knew what the cost of his ministry could be. He actually wrote letters which were released to the church members and released publicly in case he was arrested. So he knew what could happen. And one of the elders of the church, Li Yingchang, said, "Even if we are down to our last 5, worship and gatherings will go on because our faith is real. Persecution is a price worth paying for the Lord. We would rather live through it than to hide our faith, and we hope more Chinese churches will speak up and stand with us." It's incredible conviction. It's unbelievable to see that under such difficult circumstances, for them to simply say it's worth it. And it does remind me, I've been reading through Acts lately and just seeing how the early church operated, and it just reminds me of the situation they faced, where they were taken in and beaten and charged to stop preaching in the name of Jesus and all the rest of it, and they left and they actually rejoiced. They rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer. And that was the story throughout the book of Acts, and I see it so often in the tales of the persecuted church. And you know, it's probably timely that we remember something about the persecution of the Christian church throughout the ages, and it is that its situation normal. We can't forget that. Pew Research says that Christians are still the most persecuted minority on the planet. And whether or not you accept what they've said there, it is true that ours has been a story of persecution, whether it's the apostles in the beginning, whether it's the modern Chinese or Sri Lankan churches, or pretty much anything in between. You know, you have Christians seen as subversive, Christians seen as fringe dwellers on society, outcast from the mainstream. You see Christians who are guilty of criminal offences or legally punished, or you see them even taken right up to the point of execution and death, all through history. And it's true that we've been so blessed in the West. We've been blessed with this rarefied atmosphere where the prayer of Timothy in 1 Timothy 2, the prayer of Paul, in 1 Timothy 2 has been real in our times, that the godly life might be a life of peace. That's incredible. But here's the thing, and here's the reason part of the reason I talk about China, apart from our awareness and our prayers, is this. I'm up close and personal enough with the politics of the day to know and to admit, and I have to admit, because I've got a lot of life ahead of me, and I trust, and you've got to be real about these things, but to know that will not remain the same. That's unlikely to continue. I'm not one to say it, won't change. It could change by a move of God and by a mammoth effort on behalf of the church in this country, but it may not. We do live in crucial times. To cite some of the policy issues that we're contending with at the moment, it could be, that in a few short years we see the end of Christian schools as we know them. The first step in that process nearly happened at the end of last year. Or the outlawing of Christian beliefs on sexuality and gender, and Christian parents being certified as child abusers. Now, that's all part and parcel of these laws that they call, anti-LGBT conversion therapy laws, and I've talked extensively about that on other episodes. That's being pushed forward. It's actually in the news as we speak today, and I'll be doing some news pieces on that in the coming week or so. It could be that, the de-accrediting and the firing of Christian employees and professionals, and we're seeing that already all around the country. Our Human Rights Law Alliance has cases, lined up, stacked up quite deep of people who are being literally fired, losing their accreditation simply for their mainstream Christian beliefs. We saw Israel Folau, for example, quote a Bible verse, and look what's happened to him with his position with Rugby Australia. In fact, Paul Diamond, a barrister from the UK who does a lot of religious freedom cases, said 2 years ago, he said, if Australia continues down the road it's going, he said, you will find yourself in a situation where people are fired for quoting a Bible verse. And he was speaking from his experience in the UK. And, I watched that just the other day and I went, well, yeah, exactly. That's literally what is happening in Australia, a little more than most people realise because of the legal issues around these cases and actually publicising them. But, the difficulty is this. Not only is that happening, but security concerns are also intensifying. The Morrison government has given $55 million to boost security for churches and synagogues. And we've seen ACL car bomb, but also there was a guy here in Canberra arrested just the other week because he had a plot to kill Christians. And he had bought a sword from Pakistan to carry it out. He himself was a Christian once and has obviously converted to another religion. That's just happened here. These security concerns are very real, and that retaliation thing, Christchurch, and then Sri Lanka, and then who knows what. I find this challenging, and I understand that others find it challenging too. But the difficulty is we very often just don't want to talk about it. We go silent. We imagine that, well, Australia's a different place. It's a good place. It's not going to happen, or we just ignore it. I don't think we should ignore it. I think we should be honest about what lies ahead. And perhaps we'll be better at doing that if we think clearly about these matters. And it may well be, that the road we're called to tread over the next few decades might not actually be one of political success, although we hope and pray for it and we continue to do good regardless, but it may not be. It might actually be a far more traditional road of Christian faithfulness against the odds. That has been the road of so many throughout the ages of the church. You think even of what Jesus himself said, words that we don't read that much these days. On the night that he was actually betrayed, he said this to his disciples. He said, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. But all these things they will do to you on account of my name, because they do not know him who sent me. Do that's simply a statement of fact in the sense that the world has not changed. It rejected the author of life, the Holy One, the Son of God, as the apostles preached in Acts. It hated him, it persecuted him, it hounded him to the darkest death sentence available. And we are called to be his witnesses to the ends of the earth, as he said to his disciples in the first chapter of Acts. And if that's the case, we ought never to be surprised. That a world of sin rejects what is true and good and right, even rejects it violently. But see, the mystery of our age is this, and the mystery that we must always carry, and we must have faith in its truth, is that the work of God continues to advance nonetheless. His witnesses, Christ's witnesses, continue to advance God's will by faithfulness, whether it is that people see good works and glorify God, or people hear the gospel and are cut to the heart, as it records in the Bible, or the truth is spoken and evil is held at bay, as the prophets used to be called to do. We shine as lights in dark places, perhaps, and the darkness doesn't overcome it, as he's promised. We exist as salt, and we impact those in our immediate circumstances for good, or, as Jesus said, the gates of hell do not prevail against the church of Jesus Christ. That's one narrative, that good is done that God's work advances, sometimes quietly, sometimes in unseen and mysterious ways, but it does so through our continuing faithfulness and lack of compromise. But there's another reality, and a reality that, we haven't fully come to terms with in a changing Western landscape. Listen to Paul bring these two together in 2 Corinthians. He says this, he says, "We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh." And it's Easter. It's just after Easter. And there's two realities which are picked out by Paul there, which are actually Easter realities. One is the cross, the death of Christ. One is the resurrection, the life of Christ. And we are called to live in the light of, in the shadow of, and carrying both of those things. Just as much as we are called to manifest his life, to live in the power of his resurrection life, so we are called. He says, "Take up your cross and follow me." So we are told, as the world hated me, rejected me, persecuted me, and hounded me, so too they will do to you. So we are called to live in the light of all that the cross meant for Jesus Christ. The normal Christian experience of the ages, the world over, has been to know and to rejoice in both those truths, to identify with the Lord Jesus Christ in both his cross and his life. And that's what Paul's getting at. He says, yes, the cross of Christ, I identify with it in my ministry, in all that I'm doing. And you know from his experience that that's got to be true. But he says, nonetheless, we're not forsaken, we're not struck down, we're not destroyed, because the life of Jesus Christ is manifested in our bodies as well. That is to say that the same power that raised Jesus from the dead is working in us, as Paul says in Ephesians. What? To actually do his work as faithful witnesses in the world, to be changed from the inside all the way out into actions. And I think so many in the third world have a lot to teach us about. There's so many in countries like China as well, not third world, but countries where there's deep challenges have so much to teach us about this. And we can look to their example and we can calibrate our thinking and make sure that we have a good perspective on this, because times could change. And yes, we stand for truth and light and all that's good, and we do all that we can in the face of those changing times. But sometimes, God actually wants to achieve a greater and better purpose through the ashes of apparent defeat. And why do I say that? Well, the cross of Jesus is the ultimate example. There it looked like death had won, but it was so weird in the sense that as death won, so it lost. So actually it was fulfilling God's purposes that Jesus would break straight out the back of it, destroy it, put those powers to an open shame, as it says in Hebrews, and he would rise again, the first fruits of those who believe, of us who too will rise in the power of his resurrection. Sometimes that's how God works. What is evil, God turns and uses for good. And we should be ready for that come what may. But God says that he works through his faithful witnesses. And, I think that we can look to the third world. We can look to other countries to learn that great lesson, that in all things, God is at work, and we just need to have the right perspective.